The history of law, the world history of law, is a subject of the present day sequel. First of all, I show you some of my publications concerning the subject. Here are some journal articles. Ordalverfahren und Erfolgshaftung im Lichte des strukturgenetischen Ansatzes. A result of a Congress of German Historians of Law. Evolution of Morals in World History. This covers only partially the subject. And the most important subject article I would strongly recommend is the second one here, Evolution of Law and Justice from Ancient to Modern Times, published in the Journal on European History of Law, because it covers all these subjects I will address today: punishment law, legislation, guilt principle, the understanding of law, trials against animals, and so on. This article I would strongly recommend. And the first article deals only with the subject trials against animals. And the last one is again a German article. And here are two of my German books with chapters about the history of law. So I will address today 5 subjects pertaining to the history of law: trials against animals, the general understanding of law and legislation, the guilt principle, the evolution of the guilt principle, and the trials basing on evidence given by ordeals. And the 5th subject is criminal law, the way how peoples were punished in former times. Trials against animals. I have devoted to this subject already a full sequel, and therefore I will speak here only very precisely and shortly about the subject. Trials against animals were widespread in the pre-modern world, both on private forms of justice as basing on judicial official trials involving lawyers, jury, witnesses, and so on. Revenge actions against predators or damaging animals were widespread as archaic humankind believed in will and responsibility of animals, because they assigned to animals mental capacities close to those of humans. And when you assign to animals mental capacities close to humans, then you can also presuppose that there is a responsibility and moral involvement in the animal, and therefore you can make animals responsible for that what they have done, and that includes that you believe animals could execute delinquent actions. And that is the case with a pre-modern human archaic being, that they believed animals could commit crimes. For example, Indian tribes of North America tortured horses of their enemies overhauers, as they believed these horses be normal members of the hostile tribe, knowing what they are doing and willing to inflict harm to the neighboring and hostile tribes. And as the Indians tortured fighters of the hostile tribe, as they tortured their horses, in the full belief they would be responsible for their activities. And the same was with revenge actions against killing lions, wolves, other predators, killing crocodiles, or animals who have done a damage to humans, pigs who eat babies, or birds were punished because they were believed to seduce people for romantic affairs not allowed or so. There was a knight in medieval Europe who tore a nightingale to pieces because he believed that his singing seduced his wife for an unallowed alliance with another man. That's not a joke, that really happened. And therefore, it was custom to accuse animals before courtroom, charging jury and lawyers to prosecute the animal, to examine guilt or innocence, to ask witnesses, and to have a lawyer accompanied to the accused animal, and whose task was it to defend the animal against the accusations. And the lawyers and the judges spoke to the animal in the full presumption it could understand what the humans say. And we see that these trials against animals are a part of personification of animals, and the tendency to personify animals, to humanize animals, originates in the child's mentality, because children very young are incapable to know exactly the mental differences between animals on the one hand and humans on the other hand. And that is quite clear because you must stay on the formal operational stage to understand the huge differences of mental capacities pertaining to animals and to humans. And therefore, it is absolutely clear that the trials against animals are a full empirical evidence of the childlike anthropological stage of ancient humankind. I come to the next subject, the understanding of law and legislation. I spoke about this subject already in my last presentation about the evolution of democracy, and therefore I can deal with this subject very shortly. Children, by their 8th or 10th year of life, believe that the laws that govern human society are everywhere the same in every society, and that the laws are given by God, the first humans, or the parents, and that the laws are therefore mystical, holy, and unchangeable, and that it is not allowed to humans, respectively to children, to change laws according to varying circumstances. Children do not make a difference between legal laws and natural laws, as they assume that the natural laws are also legal laws given by God to nature and its elements, and that the regulation, that the natural order of the cosmos originates in the willing obedience of the natural elements to the spoken laws that God gave to nature. And therefore, ancient humankind did not discriminate between the cosmic order, the natural order, the physical order on the one hand, and the social order on the other hand. And they understood physical laws in terms of social norms, while reversely, they understood social norms as some kind of natural laws, as they assumed that humans are not allowed to change the legal laws. The legal laws come from God and are given for all eternity and are therefore unchangeable. And so we can see that both children and archaic human beings had an understanding both of physical laws and social laws beneath our modern rational understanding that discriminates physical laws from legal laws, exactly seeing their completely different nature. But a child, very young, and the archaic human being had a completely different understanding of both kinds of laws. It was Suarez who 500 years ago formulated as the first human in Europe the exact nature of physical law. This is just 500 years ago. And as long as the animistic worldview persisted, both in the child and in history, it was impossible for the scholars to understand the very nature of the physical law. Animism and precausality are two parts of the same medal. And as long as animism persists, physical laws are understood as some kind of social laws. Piaget showed that only teenagers in modern society understand the very nature of law resulting from democratic decisions. The validity of law depends now from democratic procedures and from the correct installation and institutionalization of law, and not from its holy nature. When a society agrees on a certain law and promulgates this law as valid, then it is valid depending from these processes. But a law can change over time, and its maintenance does not depend from God or from holy laws. It depends only from the correct institutionalization that the members of society have agreed that this norm or law should be kept or not. I come to the next subject. No, I should formulate the conclusion more exactly. The modern law bases on the formal operational stage as we today understand that the laws and legislation does not come from the cosmic order, but is human-made, and the correct institutionalization of the procedures that institutionalize law is the basis to the existence of correct law and of obedience to the laws. And this idea comes into being for the first time in teenagers living in modern societies due to their attainment of the formal operational stage. That was what Piaget himself figured out in his book about morals of 1932. And he already hinted at the parallel to the historical development, but he only hinted at the parallel on a very general and shallow way. I worked out this parallel exactly in my articles mentioned and in my books mentioned. And therefore, it's absolutely clear that the historical transformation from the holy law to the democratic legislation originates in psychological stage developments described by Piagetian theory. And therefore, developmental psychology explains the history of law, the history of legislation. I come to the third point, to the evolution of the guilt principle, or better to say, the capacity to identify guilt. Children, very young, tend to a phenomenon Piaget called objective responsibility. Objective responsibility means that children tend to blame people for the damage they caused without to consider their intentions and the will and the responsibility. Whenever persons make a huge damage, children tend to blame these people, even then when they were only scarcely involved into the outcome, and even if they did not want to cause the damage. And children tend to blame persons when they caused accidentally a huge damage, while children tend to forgive other persons who committed only a slight damage, but did it willingly and deliberately. So children ignore intentions or belittle intentions and concentrate and focus on the damage, the consequences, the outcome. And that has to do with the child egocentrism, because children blame other persons when they inflicted a huge damage to them, even when unwillingly. And it has to do with the child concentration on outcomes, results, and their incompetence to consider rightly intentions of other persons. what they see in reality is the outcome and not the intention of other persons. The more intelligent a person is, the more it is capable to understand the motives of and the intentions of other persons. And children are therefore not very good at that. And so children tend to ignore intentions, at least to a greater extent than older children, adolescents, and adults do. And the shift from objective responsibility to subjective responsibility is marked by Piaget with the 9th year of life. With 9 years of life, the subjective responsibility gains the overweight, but it is clear that this can only be a tendency because the proper consideration of guilt is a lifelong process, and it is not accomplished with 9 years. It is even not accomplished with 15 years of age, of course not. But there is a process, an evolution from objective to subjective responsibility during the first 2 decades of life, of course. The more people have developed the formal operational stage, the stronger they will stay, or the stronger they will obey the principles of subjective responsibility. We see the same evolution in the history of law. The historians of law called that what Piaget named objective responsibility Erfolgshaftung. And the subjective responsibility they call Schuldstrafrecht, according to guilt principle. Of course, it is not sufficient to formulate the guilt principle correctly as the Roman law had done with the name dolus malus and so on. You must also transfer the right understanding of the law principle to the judicial praxis. It is one thing to formulate the right principle in legislation and to execute it in correct judgments in the courtroom. And we see there is a general difficulty in ancient law to understand the guilt principle correctly and to discriminate intentions from consequences correctly. And there is a widespread conviction among historians of law that the ancient law tended to Erfolgshaftung, to objective responsibility, and that only the modern law is better in consideration of the guilt principle and the discrimination between intentions and consequences. I will give some examples to evidence this. Ancient law mainly follows revenge principles. And the study of revenge actions in pre-modern or archaic societies clearly shows that the revengers widely ignored the intentions of the persons who who inflicted harm. The harm itself, the outcome, and the greatness of harm the extent of harm was more decisive to arouse revenge actions than the consideration of will and intention. Revengers killed other persons who only followed their interests. And when these interests conflicted with those of the other party felt compelled to perform revenge actions, including killing. You only have to have a struggle about words, or only you have a conflict concerning the division of goods. This could suffice to execute revenge actions against those humans and parties that had different interests. And that means the consideration of intentions did not play a crucial role in those cultures. To them, revenge actions belonged as a normal form of private justice. And revenge cultures were more or less all ancient and archaic or pre-modern cultures. Even the justice systems, when they evolved and emerged in more developed societies, considered revenge actions as a normal part of the system of justice. So revenge culture by itself tends to forms of objective responsibility to the mentality of the preschool child. Let's take other examples. We have in ancient law the phenomenon of typism. Typism means that the assignment of guilt depended from the course of actions itself. Whoever killed another person with his horse by sitting on the horse was, for example, treated as a killer. And it was not examined whether the person really wanted to kill the other person. It was sufficient to see him on the horse sitting, to say, we treat him as if he is guilty, and not because of technical reasons, but because these archaic people concentrated on the simple observable phenomenon. Was a man sitting on the horse? He was taken as guilty, not only as responsible, but as guilty. And therefore, it could be that he was killed pertaining to accusation he had willingly committed an assassination. And of course, this forms of typism pervaded the general legislation. And we see everywhere in ancient law books lists of laws that based on these principles of typism. Or it was also that in laws that regulated defense actions that those were killed because they were attacked had to tolerate, for example, 3 blows of the enemy before he was allowed to defend himself violently without being punished for that. We have in medieval laws, for example, the norm in some laws or another that the defender should tolerate 3 blows with a knife or a sword of the enemy before he was allowed to beat the attacker and to kill him without being punished for his defense. That means it was a normal procedure to punish persons by execution who only defended their lives against attackers while being innocent, actually. Or what we also see in ancient and pre-modern law is the high role of collective punishment. For example, it was custom in ancient times to punish descendants of delinquents that lived generations or even centuries beforehand. So members of families or clans were punished for sins their predecessors had committed generations ago. For example, the Romans hang dogs on gallows at the Capitol as a custom lasting for centuries because dogs had not warned the Romans as the Gauls attacked them on the Capitol in the year 387 before time reckoning. And therefore the Romans had the custom to punish dogs annually over centuries after this catastrophe. This is a form of collective punishment, and it is a form of punishment of animals. So both elements of this punishment are childish in nature and born in the psyche of a child. I come to the next point. The role of ordeals in evidence systems. We know from children that they tend to decide questions of justice by drawing alms or coins from boxes, maintaining that the person who has chosen the right part of a coin is in the right or in the wrong, or that the child that wins in a fight has right and was innocent concerning any question, and so on. Children aged 7, 8, 9 years tend to such ordeals. And it originates in the child's belief that the natural elements know best who is in the right and who not. It originates in the animism of the child and in the understanding of law in the child. As the child, as I previously said, believes in the holy order of the cosmos, it also believes, therefore, in the capacity of the natural elements to know who has guilt and who is innocent. And therefore, children practice ordeals to decide questions of guilt and innocence, and so on. And we know this from Piaget, who asked children why a bridge collapsed. When escaping, children crossed the bridge after having stolen some apples in an orchard. And the small children all say the bridge collapsed because the children stole the apples, and that the wind had told to the bridge about the theft, or that the bridge knew by itself about that, what the children had done, and that the bridge did not only decide to collapse, but had also the ability to do so. That is what the early children all believe around the world. Every small child goes through a stage where he or she does believe that. In the Piaget survey of 1932, it was 80% of children aged 4 or 5 years who believed this. And then with declining numbers, children lose this belief when they are about 13, 14 years old. And Piagetian cross-cultural psychology showed that pre-modern or archaic adults maintain this belief in immanent justice, according to the bridge story, and that they do not experience the decline of belief in immanent justice, that therefore archaic or pre-modern adults do believe with 70, 18, 19, or even 100% that the bridge collapsed because the children stole the apples. And this belief in immanent justice of the elements base the ordeals archaic or pre-modern people applied in the courtroom from the Stone Ages to the advent of the modern society. We have in Europe the practice of using ordeals by the 14th century in the form of torture by the Age of Enlightenment, because the torture also can be seen, must be seen as a kind of an ordeal, because it was assumed that the torture did not violate innocent people and hit only the guilty people, and that therefore the confession made under torture is a correct confession, indicating the clear guilt of the person accused. And the other ordeals, basing on iron, fire, or hot water, or whatever, poison, for example, poison ordeals, they all base on the animism of the child and on the magical belief of the child and on the immanent justice belief of the child. And therefore, if we only knew from ancient or pre-modern people the use of ordeals, this would suffice to have evidenced their childlike anthropological nature beyond the slightest doubt. Stage theory explains both the use of ordeals in ancient law as the abolition and abrogation of ordeals in the modern world, because the abrogation of ordeals and replacement by rational proof originates in the emergence of the formal operational stage taking place in Europeans of the 18th century and later on. I come to the last example to show that the history of law can only be understood in terms of psychological stages, and that is the criminal law. Ancient or pre-modern people tend to punish delinquents very hard. The first what we see is a strange relationship between deeds and punishment. People were punished for slight deeds very hard. Even theft was sufficient to bring death to a person, or to say bad words about holy things, or to have committed some crimes whose punishment in modern society would consist of paying a small fee or to receive imprisonment for some months. But in ancient society, small crimes were often punished by capital punishment or by extremely severe punishments. That is the first indication of the ancient or pre-modern criminal law. The other is that the role executions played was very huge. Execution was a normal punishment in ancient times all over the world, from Stone Ages up to the advent of modern times. You find brutal body punishments and execution among nature peoples, among the Australians, in entire Black Africa, among the pre-Columbian Indian nations, in ancient China, ancient Russia, ancient India, and in ancient and medieval Europe, hard and brutal punishments and even executions, even for slight crimes, was a common custom. And you see there brutal forms of execution: decapitation, crucifixion, burning to death, cutting the body into single parts and elements, drowning, wiping to death, and so on. Extremely brutal forms of execution, often accompanied by long-lasting torturing and mutilation before the execution took place. And the humanization of law is a phenomenon that started in Europe in the 17th century and evolved from that time to the 19th century The 19th century was the first century in Europe not inflicting any more mutilation and body punishments apart from the execution. But you don't find any more torturing. The 19th century in Europe was the first epoch in history that abolished mutilation and body punishments. And this kind of humanization of law is a consequence of a civilization process, is a consequence of psychological stage developments taking place in the human mind. And from this source, the humanization of law disseminated around the globe via colonialism and westernization of the world. And this history of punishment law, of criminal law, originates in the psychological stage developments itself. Of course, children do not torture other children, at least not to that extent we know from history. And children do not execute other children. Of course, they do not. What the children do is that they are in favor of severe punishments. And the children demand severe punishments for slight delicts. For a child aged 5 or 7, it is the norm to understand very good the hard and brutal punishments of ancient times. They approve of the hard and brutal punishments they know from the Bible, for example. And the children have, as Piaget himself showed in his 1932 book, but later on also Lawrence Kohlberg and other authors, the children support hard punishments and are in favor of a law and order punishment law because they have now balanced understanding of the relationship between deed and punishment as ancient humankind had. And only older children have a better understanding of a good relationship between deed and punishment. So that the evolution of the humane punishment originates in psychological stage developments, while the older child approves only appropriate punishments. The early child, the young child, is in favor of hard and brutal punishments. The difference between the archaic human being and the young child is that the young child does not torture other people and does not kill other people. But what can we expect from persons who grow basing on a psychological stage of a child aged 5 or 6 years? An adult person who stays on a psychological stage of a child aged 5, 6, or 7 years tends to torture other people and to execute other people for slight crimes. While the modern child living in modern society tends to hard and brutal punishments, but does not execute them. But the understanding and the approval of hard punishments is the same, both in the child and in the archaic human being. And we do not know what children would do if they had to decide in the courtroom about the punishment of delinquents. Modern children in modern society do not execute the criminal law, but how they would decide and act when they were in power of the institutions, we don't know. But again, it is absolutely clear that the history of the criminal law originates in the psychological stage developments we can observe in children's and teenagers' developments. And so I could show that the total history of law pertaining to the 5 elements I described, that the total history of law originates in psychological stage developments, that only the stage theory can explain the foundations of the history of law. And that is what I have done over the past 40 years in my contributions to the subject.